us what the Mexican Revolution was all about, what Mexican society was like leading up to the revolution, and what the revolution left in its wake.
Sure. Well, the Mexican Revolution that broke out in 1910 is often narrated as a contained national event. And usually described as something that exploded out of opposition that coalesced against the president, whose name was Porfirio Diaz, who ruled for over 3 decades, beginning in 1876 and ending shortly after the revolution in 1911. And what you see under Diaz's rule, that entire period is called the Porfiriato. You see the modernization of the country. There's dramatic new incursions of foreign investment, and there's a complementary growth of roads and rails and pipelines. And in order to accommodate a lot of this new investment, you have mass dispossessions of the peasantry. You have the intense growth of new industries, which means, the intense exploitation of a growing industrial working class and factories and mines and oil fields. You also have new housing markets. So you have a lot of renters that are also being exploited. And you have a frustrated middle class who feels like they're both not being represented and also they're not profiting from these new machinations. So you have fractures among the elites. You have a loss of legitimacy because essentially Diaz is just trying to rule with an iron fist. And is putting quite a lot of soldiers and rurales on these railroads. So you have the kind of perfect cauldron for revolution. I would just say two things though about this. One is that sometimes there's a danger in exceptionalizing this as just a Mexican story. This is also a global story. The conditions that are happening in Mexico are happening around the world as different countries are being pulled into the frenzy of finance capital. So you have dispossession, the loss of subsistence agriculture. You have people unmoored from ways of life. And people are forced to move because of colonial dispossession, because of imperial rule, because of military aggression or the threat of it, and because of capitalist immiseration. Um, the conditions that produce the Mexican Revolution are not just unique to Mexico. And and I'm sorry if I'm jumping on your next question, but there's importantly a lot that prefigures U.S. hegemony in that also build the conditions for the Mexican Revolution. So just very quickly, by the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, a quarter of all U.S. investment, lies in Mexico. U.S. investors own like over 80% of mineral rights. They own more of Mexico's surface than all Mexican entities. And the kind of patterns of rule that the U.S. develops in Mexico portends, forms of rule that it develops over the 20th century in other countries. It's in Mexico that the U.S. becomes a creditor nation for the first time. And I think that there's a new modality of imperialism that develops in the U.S.'s relationship with Mexico. So, it's both an event that I feel like has to be understood in a global context. And if you're somebody who's interested in thinking about the ascendancy of U.S. hegemony, you have to think about the U.S.'s relationship to Mexico in this period.
Absolutely. And simultaneously, for those who were opposing imperialism and opposing US hegemony and finance capital and all of that, you see that thread as well. Like I was in reading through your book and in thinking about this period, I couldn't help but thinking back to like, John Reed and John Reed's time, in reporting about what was in Mexico, coming back to the US. And a few years later, he's in Russia, and writing, 10 Days That Shook the World. And the, literally some of the same people and individuals went from one to the other and could make some of these connections. So talk a little bit about that, because this is something I think we could think of in a modern context that maybe didn't exist in the century prior to that.
Mm. Well, yeah, I have so much to say. I'm just trying to collect my thoughts. This is a great point. Um, Maybe I'll say it this way. Yes, John Reed is somebody who figures in the book, and a lot of people forget. Before he wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, he was in Mexico. His first book is an insurgent Mexico. He goes down as a reporter for Metropolitan magazine. and is, writing, as I say, not only reportage but also short stories about what he's seeing there, and has a very unique perspective on the kind of subjectivities of U.S. imperialism that he sees through like these, fortune hunters and, like small scale investors that he's meeting in Mexico. I talk about that a little bit there. But I think what's interesting is that, as you say, there's a lot of people who, I think we would associate with an internationalist tradition because of their relationship to the Communist International, which doesn't, happen until 1919. We forget that a lot of these figures are in Mexico prior to that, and I just want to say I feel like we forget sometimes that the kind of you can trace uh, the the kind of chaos that the global capitalist system throws up and how it produces its own contradictions by thinking about what preceded the Comintern and the Communist International. I mean, for example, Ho Chi Minh, before he became a major opponent of French colonialism and U.S. imperialism in Vietnam, he was a founding member of the French Communist Party. Sen Katayama, who was a Japanese radical, a key opponent of Japanese imperialism, he was a founding member of the Communist Party USA, and he was a staunch ally to Black radicals in the U.S. who saw him as a fighter against white supremacy. In the book, I talk about M.N. Roy, who who began as a fighting British colonialism in India, and ends up, after seeking arms and support for an anti-colonial struggle, he ends up in revolutionary Mexico in 1917, and he says, "There in the land of my rebirth." He goes from being what he calls a diehard nationalist to actually triangulating his experience and becoming an internationalist. And actually, M.N. Roy, this man from India, fighting British colonialism, becomes one of the founding members of the Mexican Communist Party. So, I think that this is highlighting these figures offers us a different trajectory to think about the history of internationalism. So instead of saying, here's what the Comintern organized and here's a kind of organizational history we can follow from there, I think there's something tremendously fascinating to think about what compelled people to move, what compelled people to develop solidarity, and how do we trace an internationalism from below, that preceded the Comintern.
And another interesting thing about this book, and something I wanted to commend you on as well, is that in highlighting some of the figures that you do, I mean, you highlight a lot of people, so I'm not going to say it's just like three or four. There's a lot of different people that make an appearance here, some more, some less. But some of the key figures that really struck me as, I don't know, what do you want to call them? Uh, revolutionary figures that aren't your household names, aren't the ones that people would traditionally think of when they think of this period. Whether it was Alexandra Kollontai or Elizabeth Catlett, the artist, or whomever, there were a lot of different people that get highlighted in this book to illustrate much larger points. So I wanted to ask you two, I guess, related questions. One, the importance of highlighting these kinds of figures. And then secondly, talk a little bit about cultural production, because like I was thinking about that, my background, at least in undergrad, was in art history. So I had encountered Elizabeth Catlett in a much different context without the political background and understanding all of that. So, anyway, can you talk a little bit about cultural production as well and the making of this revolutionary culture?
Sure. Well, let me answer the first part of your question first, which is, I'll just say simply that a tip Marcus Rediker gave me was he said, if you want to tell history from below, you have to go where the archives of working class and poor people are held, right? And so, unlike the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, there are seldom, well preserved archives of papers where you could easily walk in and read about people's lives and struggles. So what he said is, you have to go to where people's stories are. So that means going to the welfare rolls. That means going to prison records, right? And so a lot of the book, archivally, goes to these places, and sometimes it follows the kind of big names in order to tell, like you said, the histories of people who normally fall out of view. So, um, chapter 3 is called How to Make a University, and it's about Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. And I initially had chose to tell this story because this is where Ricardo Flores Magon, one of the key agitators of the Mexican Revolution, he dies in Kansas. So there's a very strong paper trail that takes us to his incarceration there. And once he's there, there's an extraordinary number of records of the people that he was commiserating with, that he was educating, that he was organizing with. And so there's a way that I try to tell the story of some of those figures, people like Jose Martinez, um, who was a Mexican prisoner who allegedly, fought to defend Flores Magon's honor, who participated in this University of Radicalism that we would not have heard of otherwise. And maybe I'll just to start answering the second question. What I found when I went into the National Archive in Kansas City, Missouri, was an actual university that the prisoners had built. So, World War I, you have these new federal laws against espionage and sedition, which criminalizes dissent. So, you have communists, anarchists, pacifists, nationalists, socialists. Everybody's locked up together, and they're organizing with each other, and they're building an actual university. So, I think there's, extraordinary columns they're writing and the papers they're producing. There's a really rich history of culture in that chapter that I'd be happy to talk more about. But you asked me about Elizabeth Catlett, and I feel like I could talk about her for years and years. So it's Elizabeth Catlett's image that graces the cover of my book. And uh, what can I say? I mean, culture, as you mentioned, is essential to building any kind of revolutionary uh, movement. And so in the sixth chapter, I talk about Elizabeth Catlett, who was an artist, a sculptor, a printmaker, who belonged to and also helped build a number of different internationalist cultural centers. So in the book, I talk about the Southside Community Art Center in Chicago, the George Washington Carver School in Harlem. She was a teacher, a beloved teacher in both of these places. And in Mexico City, she became a part of something called the Taller de Gráfica Popular, which was another internationalist art collective. And, what I'm interested in tracing in that chapter was how, again, were all these seemingly disparate radical struggles that were opposing racism, sexism, fascism, militarism, and capitalism, how did people make sense of them, and how did they produce a revolutionary culture? And how can we start to read some of that backwards by looking at the art that was produced in these places?
I want to spend at least a couple of minutes returning to W.E.B. Du Bois, since some of his ideas really inject themselves actually throughout the book, really. So you talk a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois and which of his ideas, maybe either the more popular ones that people might know, or, I don't know how I want to frame this other than to say, just tell us a little bit about Du Bois and Du Boisian thinking and how that forms part of the framework of history in this book.
Sure. Well, Du Bois is a huge influence through and through. In the acknowledgments, I mentioned that I worked with Robin D.G. Kelly, who, we would do. We'd spend a lot of time talking about Du Bois, and he would dare me. He would say, "This is how you need to write." So, stylistically, there was a lot I took from Du Bois. He's, some people think about him as a kind of like late Victorian writer. He has these, he's a gorgeous, phenomenal writer, but he also takes poetry and prose really seriously, and I like that challenge. So there's Du Bois. I think is also in the kind of texture of the book. But conceptually, I'm really pleased that Du Bois seems to be getting his due in a way that I don't think he was when I started conceptualizing the book. There's different ways that Du Bois, like a lot of Black radical figures, can seem to be frozen in time in some of his insights. Du Bois even said to his biographer, like, "Do not let the earlier part of my life overshadow the later part of my life." And Du Bois was uh, quite a brilliant thinker about revolution, about capitalism, about Marxist thought.